Grandma doesn't want to see you, Richard Carter said quietly in the hospital hallway, blocking the door with his shoulder as if those words alone could erase 30 years of love between Margaret Carter and her grandson. Daniel Carter stood there for a moment, not speaking, not arguing, simply staring at the door behind his father where the faint hum of hospital machines drifted into the hallway like a distant echo. The drive to St. Luke's Medical Center had taken him 42 minutes, just over 20 miles through late evening traffic, and the entire way he had kept remembering the last phone call he'd had with his grandmother 3 days earlier, when her voice had sounded thin but determined as she told him, "You come visit soon, Danny. I have something important to tell you." Margaret Carter had always called him Danny, even when he turned 32 and moved into his own apartment across town. Hearing his father say she didn't want to see him felt like hearing someone claim the sky wasn't blue. It simply didn't fit with reality. Linda Carter, Daniel's mother, stood beside Richard with her arms folded, her expression composed in that distant way Daniel had seen many times growing up whenever family disagreements appeared. "The doctor said she needs rest," she added, avoiding his eyes as nurses walked quietly past with rolling carts and the soft squeak of rubber wheels against polished floors. Daniel glanced at the small window in the hospital door behind them. Through the glass, he could see the faint outline of his grandmother's bed, the pale blanket, the dim glow of a bedside monitor. He couldn't see her face from where he stood, but he knew she was there, the same woman who had taught him how to tie a fishing knot on the edge of Lake Greenwood when he was 8 years old, the same woman who had slipped a folded check into his backpack the day he left for college because she believed he deserved a chance no matter what anyone else said. "She asked for me," Daniel said quietly, his voice calm but certain. Richard shook his head almost immediately. "You're mistaken." The answer came too quickly, too cleanly. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, not anger exactly, but the slow realization that something about this moment was wrong in a way he couldn't yet explain. The hallway lights were soft and warm, reflecting off cream-colored walls and framed photographs of city skylines, the kind hospitals used to make visitors feel less like they were standing in a place between life and loss. Daniel had imagined this visit differently during the drive. He thought he would walk into the room, sit beside Margaret Carter, maybe hold her hand and hear whatever it was she wanted to tell him. Instead, he stood outside the door like a stranger while his own parents guarded the entrance. Minutes passed quietly. Nurses moved in and out of other rooms. Somewhere down the corridor, a television murmured softly. Daniel leaned against the wall across from the door, folding his arms, watching the small window, as if his grandmother might suddenly appear and wave him in. Richard and Linda eventually stepped inside the room, closing the door behind them with a quiet click that sounded far louder than it should have. Daniel waited there in the hallway for nearly an hour, the digital clock above the nurse's station slowly changing from 8:12 p.m. to 9:03. No one called for him. No one opened the door. When the doctor finally emerged, removing his glasses and speaking in the low, measured voice doctors use when delivering difficult news, Daniel understood immediately from the expression alone. Margaret Carter had passed away just minutes earlier, and Daniel Carter had never been allowed to say goodbye. Daniel Carter did not leave the hospital immediately after the doctor spoke those quiet words. He remained seated in a hard plastic chair across from the closed door, his hands folded together as if he were still waiting for someone to open it and tell him there had been a mistake. The hallway slowly emptied as the night shift settled in, nurses speaking softly at the station and the distant sound of an elevator bell echoing every few minutes. Richard and Linda Carter walked out of the room nearly 10 minutes after the doctor had finished speaking with them, their expressions calm in a way that felt strangely rehearsed. Linda held her purse tightly against her side while Richard adjusted his jacket as if they had just finished an ordinary appointment. Neither of them looked directly at Daniel at first. Finally, Richard stopped in front of him and said in a low voice that the hospital staff needed time with Margaret and that there was nothing more to do tonight. Daniel studied his father's face, searching for some trace of grief, but the expression he saw was distant and controlled. Linda gently placed a hand on Richard's arm and suggested they all go home and get some rest. Daniel stood slowly, glancing once more at the hospital door that had remained closed to him the entire evening. For 32 years, Margaret Carter had been the one person in the family who never treated him like an outsider. When Daniel was a boy, his parents believed discipline meant silence and obedience, but Margaret believed questions meant curiosity, and curiosity meant intelligence. She had been the one who drove him to his first fishing trip at Lake Greenwood, nearly 60 miles from their home, waking before sunrise and packing sandwiches into a small cooler while Daniel sat in the passenger seat, watching the sky turn pale blue above the highway. She had been the one who showed up at his high school graduation with a camera older than Daniel himself and cheered louder than anyone else when his name was called. Even years later, when he moved into a small apartment across town and started working long hours at a local design firm, Margaret still called him every Sunday afternoon just to ask how the week had gone. Daniel remembered the warmth of her kitchen, the smell of cinnamon tea, the way she listened carefully when he spoke as if his thoughts actually mattered. That memory made the silence of the hospital hallway feel even heavier. As Daniel followed his parents toward the elevator, he noticed how quickly they were leaving, how neither of them looked back toward the room where Margaret Carter had spent her final hours. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and the three of them stepped inside. For a few seconds, none of them spoke while the numbers above the door slowly counted down from 4 to 1. Daniel finally asked a quiet question that had been forming in his mind ever since his father blocked that hospital door. He asked whether Margaret had said anything before she passed away, whether she had asked for anyone in particular. Richard hesitated just long enough for Daniel to notice before answering that Margaret had been too weak to speak much at the end. Linda nodded beside him as if confirming the story. Daniel did not respond. Instead, he looked at his reflection in the polished metal wall of the elevator and felt the first quiet thread of doubt begin to weave itself through the night. Because Daniel Carter knew his grandmother better than anyone in that building, and the idea that she had chosen not to see him during her final hours felt less like the truth and more like a door that someone else had decided to keep closed. The drive home from the hospital that night felt longer than the 42 minutes it had taken Daniel Carter to get there earlier, even though the same quiet highways stretched beneath the headlights of his car. Streetlights passed one by one along the roadside, while the city slowly thinned into dark neighborhoods and empty intersections. Daniel kept both hands on the steering wheel and replayed the evening in his mind, every detail returning with uncomfortable clarity. The way Richard Carter had stepped in front of the hospital door, the way Linda Carter avoided looking at him, the way neither of them seemed surprised when the doctor delivered the final news. By the time Daniel pulled into the parking lot outside his apartment building, the clock on his dashboard read 11:27 in the evening. The air outside carried the cool smell of early autumn as he stepped out of the car and looked up at the dark windows of the building where he had lived for the past 3 years. Inside the apartment, everything was quiet and exactly the same as he had left it earlier that evening. The kitchen light still glowing above the small wooden table where he had dropped his keys before rushing to the hospital. Daniel poured himself a glass of water and stood at the sink, staring out through the window at the empty street below. Margaret Carter had never once made him feel like he did not belong in the family. That was the memory that returned to him again and again as midnight approached. When Daniel was 10 years old and struggled in school, it was Margaret who spent entire afternoons helping him with homework at the kitchen table while a small radio played old country songs in the background. When he was 18 and nervous about leaving home for college nearly 200 miles away, Margaret had been the one who drove him to campus with a trunk full of homemade food containers and quietly slipped an envelope with $500 into his backpack just before saying goodbye. She had always believed in him even when his parents did not fully understand the choices he made. That was why the events of the hospital hallway felt impossible to accept. Daniel walked into the living room and sat on the couch, remembering the final conversation he had shared with Margaret only 3 days earlier. Her voice had been weaker than usual, but there had been a calm certainty in the way she spoke. She had told him that families sometimes hide things when money and inheritance are involved, and that people reveal their true character when they believe no one is watching. At the time, Daniel had laughed softly and told her she was worrying too much. Now those words echoed differently in his mind. Daniel reached for his phone and opened the contact labeled Margaret Carter. The last message from her still sat there, sent earlier that week. It simply read, "Call me when you have time." Daniel stared at the screen for several seconds before placing the phone on the coffee table. Something about the night felt unfinished. as if the truth about what had happened in that hospital room had not yet fully surfaced. The quiet apartment seemed to hold that question in the air around him while the hours slowly moved toward morning. Daniel Carter did not yet know it, but the answers would arrive sooner than he expected, carried not by family, but by a voice from outside the Carter household that had been quietly waiting for the right moment to speak. The next morning arrived quietly, with pale sunlight slipping through the blinds of Daniel Carter's apartment and spreading across the living room floor. Daniel had barely slept. The clock on the microwave read 6:32 when he finally stood up from the couch, where he had fallen asleep sometime before dawn. For a few moments, he simply stood there in the quiet apartment, listening to the distant sound of traffic beginning to fill the streets outside. The events of the previous night returned slowly but clearly. The hospital hallway, the closed door, the calm expressions on his parents' faces. Daniel poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the small wooden table near the kitchen window. Margaret Carter had always started her mornings the same way, with a cup of coffee and a newspaper spread across the table while the radio played softly in the background. Daniel could almost picture her there, turning the pages carefully and circling articles she thought he would find interesting. The memory felt both comforting and painful at the same time. At 8:15 his phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, with an area code from the downtown business district nearly 10 miles away. Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. A calm professional voice introduced himself as Michael Lawson, an attorney who had represented Margaret Carter for many years. Daniel straightened slightly in his chair as the man continued speaking. Mr. Lawson explained that Margaret had left very specific instructions regarding the handling of her estate, and that several documents would need to be reviewed by family members in the coming days. He spoke carefully, choosing each word with the precision of someone used to dealing with complicated family matters. Daniel asked quietly whether his parents had already been contacted. The attorney replied that they had received the same message earlier that morning and that he was arranging a formal meeting at his office later in the week. The office was located 23 miles away in a brick building near the county courthouse. Daniel wrote down the address while listening to the steady tone of the lawyer's voice. Before ending the call, Mr. Lawson added something that caught Daniel's attention. He said that Margaret Carter had been very clear about one thing before she passed away. She wanted Daniel present when her final documents were read. After the call ended, Daniel sat silently for a long moment, staring at the piece of paper where he had written the address. The quiet apartment suddenly felt different, as if something important had shifted just beneath the surface of the past 24 hours. Daniel thought again about the hospital hallway and the door that had remained closed to him. If Margaret Carter truly wanted him present for the reading of her estate documents, then the events of the previous night made even less sense. Daniel stood up and walked to the window overlooking the street. Cars were beginning to move through the morning traffic, while sunlight reflected off the glass windows of nearby buildings. Somewhere across town, Richard and Linda Carter were likely preparing for the same meeting with the attorney. Daniel had no idea what would be revealed inside that office later in the week, but he knew one thing with quiet certainty. Margaret Carter had never been careless with her decisions, especially when it came to family. And whatever she had arranged before her final days, she had done it with purpose. 3 days later, Daniel Carter left his apartment just after 8 in the morning and began the drive toward downtown, where Michael Lawson's office was located. The city traffic moved steadily along the highway while gray clouds hung low over the skyline, giving the morning a quiet and serious atmosphere. Daniel followed the directions he had written down earlier that week, eventually turning onto a narrow street lined with old brick buildings that had stood there for decades. The office of Lawson and Hargrove Legal Services occupied the second floor of a restored building across from the county courthouse. Daniel parked along the curb, stepped out of his car, and looked up at the brass sign beside the entrance door before walking inside. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. A receptionist greeted him with a polite nod and asked him to take a seat while the attorney finished another meeting. Daniel sat in a leather chair near the window and watched people crossing the street outside while the minutes passed slowly. Nearly 10 minutes later, the elevator opened and Richard Carter stepped out, followed by Linda Carter. They had arrived together just as Daniel expected. Richard wore the same calm expression Daniel had seen in the hospital hallway, while Linda carried a folder tucked neatly beneath her arm. Neither of them looked surprised to see Daniel waiting there. Richard offered a brief nod that carried the same distant politeness he used with coworkers rather than family. A moment later, the receptionist stood and invited all three of them into a conference room at the end of the hallway. The room was quiet and orderly, with a long oak table positioned beneath a row of tall windows that overlooked the courthouse lawn nearly 100 yards away. Attorney Michael Lawson entered a few moments later carrying a thin stack of documents. He greeted each of them with a measured handshake before sitting at the head of the table. His voice was calm and professional as he explained that Margaret Carter had prepared her estate documents carefully during the past 2 years, and that she had left clear instructions about how those documents should be presented. Daniel noticed that Richard and Linda sat upright with an air of quiet confidence, as if the meeting would simply confirm what they already expected. Lawson opened the first folder and began reviewing the formal will, explaining that Margaret Carter had left the family house and several personal possessions to Richard and Linda. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair while Linda gave a small satisfied nod. For a moment the room felt almost routine, as if the meeting might end quickly with nothing more than legal paperwork and polite signatures. But Lawson did not close the folder when he finished speaking. Instead, he lifted another set of documents from his briefcase and placed them carefully on the table. His expression remained calm, yet there was a subtle shift in his tone as he explained that Margaret Carter had also established a separate financial arrangement several months before her final hospitalization. Daniel watched quietly as the attorney adjusted his glasses and looked down at the page in front of him. Richard and Linda exchanged a brief glance, clearly unsure why the meeting was continuing. Then Michael Lawson spoke again, and the quiet certainty that had filled the room only seconds earlier began to fade. Michael Lawson adjusted the second set of documents on the table and paused briefly before continuing, as if making certain everyone in the room understood that the next part of the discussion carried a different weight than the first. The quiet confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier slowly faded, while Richard Carter leaned forward slightly in his chair. Linda Carter sat very still beside him, her hands resting on the folder she had brought with her. Lawson spoke in the same calm and professional voice, explaining that several months before her passing, Margaret Carter had created a financial trust separate from the traditional will that had just been reviewed. He explained that this trust had been established through a series of legal filings and financial transfers that were completed well in advance of her final hospitalization. Daniel Carter listened without speaking, watching the attorney's careful movements as he turned each page. The room was so quiet that the faint sound of traffic from the courthouse lawn outside could be heard through the windows nearly 100 yards away. Lawson continued explaining that the purpose of such a trust was to ensure that certain assets were managed and distributed according to instructions that could not easily be altered once the documents had been finalized. Richard cleared his throat and asked a short question about what specific assets were involved, his voice carrying a controlled impatience that had not been present earlier in the meeting. Lawson nodded politely and explained that the trust contained the majority of Margaret Carter's financial investments, including several long-term accounts and property interests that had grown steadily in value over the past decade. Linda's expression shifted slightly at those words. The calm certainty she had shown earlier began to fade as she exchanged a quick glance with Richard. Daniel remained silent, his attention fixed on the attorney as Lawson finally reached the final page of the document. Then Lawson lifted his eyes and spoke the sentence that changed the entire tone of the room. The trust, he explained clearly, had been established with a single primary beneficiary, Daniel Carter. For several seconds no one spoke. Richard's expression hardened as he leaned back in his chair, clearly trying to process what he had just heard. Linda looked from the attorney to Daniel, and then back again, as if expecting someone to clarify the statement. Lawson continued calmly, explaining that Margaret Carter had personally instructed that Daniel be granted full beneficiary status within the trust, which meant he would oversee and ultimately receive the financial assets contained within it. The value of those assets was considerably larger than the property listed in the traditional will. Daniel felt the quiet weight of the moment settle across the room, while Richard slowly folded his arms. Linda finally spoke, asking whether there had been some misunderstanding about the paperwork. Lawson responded with the steady confidence of someone who had prepared every document himself. There was no misunderstanding. Margaret Carter had reviewed the trust personally and signed the final authorization in his office nearly 4 months earlier. The attorney then reached into the folder once more and removed a sealed envelope addressed in familiar handwriting. He placed it gently on the table in front of Daniel. Margaret Carter, he explained, had also left a personal letter with instructions that it be delivered directly to her grandson during this meeting. The quiet tension that had filled the room moments earlier now felt heavier than before, as if the true reason behind the events of the hospital hallway had finally begun to surface. Daniel Carter looked down at the envelope resting on the polished oak table in front of him. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Margaret Carter had always written in careful, steady letters that leaned slightly to the right. The same handwriting that had once appeared on birthday cards and small notes she used to slip into his lunch bag when he was a child. For a moment Daniel did not move. The room remained silent except for the faint ticking of a clock mounted somewhere in the hallway outside the conference room. Richard Carter shifted in his chair across the table, his arms still folded tightly across his chest, while his eyes remained fixed on the envelope. Linda Carter sat very still beside him, her expression tense and uncertain, as if she were waiting for someone else to explain what had just happened. Attorney Michael Lawson nodded gently toward the envelope and said that Margaret Carter had specifically instructed that Daniel open the letter during this meeting. Daniel slowly reached forward and lifted the envelope from the table. The paper felt slightly worn, as though Margaret had handled it several times before sealing it. He opened it carefully and unfolded the single sheet inside. The moment his eyes moved across the page, he felt the familiar warmth of her voice returning through the words. Margaret had written the letter only a week before she entered the hospital. She began by telling Daniel that she was proud of the man he had become and that she trusted his judgment more than anyone else in the family. The letter explained that she had watched the family change over the years, especially when conversations about property and inheritance began to appear more frequently during holiday dinners and quiet afternoon visits. Margaret wrote that money had a way of revealing people's priorities, and she had spent the past 2 years carefully deciding how to protect the parts of her life that mattered most. Daniel continued reading while the room remained completely silent. Margaret explained that she knew Daniel would never measure family by the value of a bank account or a piece of land. That was why she had chosen to place the majority of her financial investments into the trust under his name. The trust was not only meant to support Daniel, but also to ensure that the resources she had built over a lifetime would be managed responsibly for the future. Daniel paused when he reached the final part of the letter. Margaret's handwriting became slightly firmer in those last lines. She wrote that she had suspected there might be attempts to control who could see her during her final days, especially if certain family members believed the details of her estate had not yet been finalized. That was why she had made every legal arrangement months earlier, while she was still strong enough to visit the attorney's office herself. Daniel lowered the letter slowly and looked up. Richard and Linda Carter were both watching him now, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet uneasiness that filled the room like a slow-moving shadow. Daniel did not say anything at first. Instead, he placed the letter back on the table beside the envelope and sat quietly for a moment, realizing that Margaret Carter had understood far more about the family than anyone had realized while she was alive. The silence that followed the reading of Margaret Carter's letter stretched across the conference room like a slow-moving cloud. Daniel Carter remained seated with the folded paper resting lightly in his hands, while across the table Richard Carter shifted in his chair as if the air in the room had suddenly grown heavier. Linda Carter glanced toward the attorney and then back toward Daniel, clearly searching for some explanation that would restore the certainty she had carried into the meeting earlier that morning. Attorney Michael Lawson cleared his throat softly and continued speaking in the same steady tone he had used since the meeting began. He explained that Margaret Carter had visited his office personally 4 months earlier and spent nearly 2 hours reviewing every page of the trust agreement. During that meeting, she had been very clear about the reasoning behind her decision. Margaret had said that she wanted her financial investments managed by someone who valued patience and responsibility rather than immediate control. Lawson described how she had reviewed the trust structure carefully, asking detailed questions about how the accounts would be protected and how future decisions regarding those assets would be handled. Daniel listened quietly while the attorney spoke, remembering how Margaret had always approached decisions slowly and thoughtfully, especially when it involved something important to the family. Richard leaned forward again, his earlier calm now replaced by a sharper tone as he asked whether the trust could be modified or challenged after Margaret's passing. Lawson shook his head gently and explained that the documents had been completed under full legal supervision and properly filed with the appropriate authorities. Margaret Carter had been fully aware of her actions when she signed the trust agreement. Linda finally spoke, her voice tight with disbelief as she asked why Margaret would choose Daniel instead of her own son to oversee the majority of the family's financial resources. Lawson paused briefly before answering, choosing his words with careful precision. He said that Margaret Carter had believed Daniel possessed a steadiness that she admired, a quality she felt would protect the long-term value of what she had built during her lifetime. The attorney also mentioned that Margaret had spoken warmly about Daniel during their final meeting, describing him as someone who understood the difference between ownership and responsibility. The quiet room seemed to absorb those words slowly. Daniel looked down at the letter again and noticed one line he had almost missed earlier. Margaret had written that true inheritance was not simply about property or money, but about trust placed in someone's character. Daniel folded the paper gently and placed it back inside the envelope, while sunlight from the tall windows stretched across the table between them. Across the room, Richard and Linda Carter sat without speaking, the earlier confidence that had brought them to the meeting replaced by a quiet realization that Margaret Carter had planned the future of her estate long before anyone expected. And in doing so, she had left behind something far more deliberate than anyone in that room had imagined. Daniel Carter remained seated at the conference table for several moments after the attorney finished speaking, the quiet weight of Margaret Carter's decisions settling slowly into the room. Sunlight continued to stretch across the oak surface of the table, while traffic moved steadily outside the courthouse, nearly 100 yards away. Richard Carter finally stood from his chair and walked a few steps toward the window, his posture stiff as he looked down at the street below. Linda Carter remained seated, her hands resting quietly in her lap, while her eyes moved between the attorney and the envelope that still lay beside Daniel's arm. Attorney Michael Lawson carefully gathered the remaining documents into a neat stack and explained that the trust arrangements would now move forward exactly as Margaret Carter had written them. The legal structure had already been finalized months earlier, and Daniel Carter would officially assume responsibility as the primary beneficiary and future manager of the assets within the trust. Daniel listened calmly while the words settled in. Only a few days earlier, he had been standing outside a hospital door, wondering why he had not been allowed inside to say goodbye. Now he understood that Margaret Carter had been thinking far beyond that final moment. She had quietly arranged the future of her estate, while she was still strong enough to make every decision clearly and deliberately. Richard eventually turned back toward the table, his expression now more tired than angry. He asked a few final questions about the timing of the trust transfers and the process that would follow in the coming weeks. Lawson answered each one with the same steady professionalism, explaining that financial institutions would be notified and that Daniel would receive full documentation outlining the responsibilities attached to the trust. Linda finally stood as well, smoothing the front of her jacket before glancing once more toward Daniel. There was something different in her expression now, something quieter and more reflective than the confidence she had shown earlier that morning. Daniel carefully folded Margaret Carter's letter and placed it back inside the envelope before standing from his chair. The meeting slowly came to an end as Lawson escorted them toward the hallway outside the conference room. The building felt calm and ordinary again, the same polished floors and quiet offices that had existed long before this morning's conversation. When Daniel stepped outside onto the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun had already begun to settle across the courthouse lawn. Cars moved through the intersection while people walked past carrying briefcases and coffee cups, unaware that anything unusual had taken place inside the building behind them. Daniel paused for a moment beside his car and looked down at the envelope resting in his hand. Margaret Carter had spent a lifetime building the things she believed mattered most, not only money or property, but also the quiet understanding of who could be trusted to carry that work forward. In the end, she had left something far more meaningful than a simple inheritance. She had left Daniel Carter the responsibility to prove that her trust had been placed exactly where it belonged,